81 carbonized loaves arranged in perfect rows, the baker's circular mark still visible on the crust of each one. The oven was burning when time stood still. No other place in the ancient world has been found quite like this. Production caught in the exact second of catastrophe. The bakery of Pompeii was discovered intact in 1930. The loaves were still in the oven. The structure had been sealed since August 24th, year 79. It was the only physical record of the ancient world, with work interrupted, frozen in the exact moment the world changed. The bakery operated on one of the busiest commercial streets in Pompeii, Region 7, Insula 12, Door 8, a volcanic stone mill on the ground floor, a fire brick oven in the back, a grain silo on the upper floor. The structure was not built to last 2,000 years. It was built to produce 200 loaves a day, 6 days a week, for the entire working life of the baker. It was a family operation. The father taught the son took over the business, the grandson inherited the oven and the customers. The baker's name was not preserved in any official record, but the mark he pressed into each loaf was known throughout the city. A circle with 8 radial lines stretching from the center. Simple, unmistakable. That mark was commercial protection, traceability, reputation, a defense against fraud. In Pompeii, where 15 bakeries competed for the same market, the mark was the only guarantee that a customer was buying from the supplier they knew. The baker never imagined this mark would become the most preserved signature in Pompeii, that it would survive longer than any public inscription, any imperial mosaic, or any monument built to last. But before understanding why it survived, we need to go back to a moment when everything still functioned normally. The bakery was built during the reign of Augustus, between the year 20 BC and the year 10 AD. The structure was just over 80 years old when the eruption struck. The lot was chosen for 3 practical reasons: proximity to the Via dell'Abbondanza, the main commercial street, direct access to the public aqueduct, meaning running water for the dough, and it was right next to the grain market, which cut down transportation costs. The mill sat on the ground floor, visible from the street, 2 circular stones of volcanic basalt. The bottom stone was fixed. The top stone was mobile, turned by a donkey walking in circles for 8 hours a day. The sound of the working mill, stone grinding against stone, could be heard over 300 feet away. A man walking down the Via dell'Abbondanza at dawn would hear the mill before he saw the bakery. That sound was a guarantee. It meant the daily bread was being prepared right then and there. Fresh grain, freshly milled flour. The oven was in the back, separated from the street by a brick wall. A domed structure, it held 80 to 90 loaves per batch, an internal temperature over 500 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained by olive wood branches and vineyard prunings. The baker would light the oven at 4 in the morning. He fed the fire for an hour, waited for the heat to stabilize, pulled out the coals, put the loaves in, sealed the opening with an iron plate. He tracked the time by the sun's position in the side window. Each bake took 40 minutes, 5 bakes a day, 450 loaves. Production began before sunrise and ended at noon. The grain room upstairs stored enough wheat for 15 days of operation. Amphorae of olive oil to grease the pans, salt from the port of Ostia, a natural sourdough starter kept at room temperature, fed daily with fresh flour and water. The whole operation relied on a delicate balance. If the starter died, production stopped until he could get a new culture from a fellow baker. If the mill broke, he had to haul pre-milled grain. That meant higher costs and lower quality control. If the oven cracked, the temperature would swing and the bread would bake unevenly. But none of that happened. The mill worked. The starters survived. The oven held strong. The one thing nobody controlled was Vesuvius. The volcano sat 6 miles to the north, visible from any high point in the city, covered in vineyards all the way to the summit. Nobody in Pompeii called Vesuvius a volcano. That word did not even exist in Latin with that meaning. It was just a mountain. Strabo, a geographer who visited the area 30 years before the eruption, described the peak as looking burned. Pliny the Elder, the naturalist who died trying to study the eruption up close, had documented that the mountain was fertile and inhabited to the very top, but no record pointed to an eruption in recent history. There was no collective memory of destruction, no local legends about fire bursting from the earth. Earthquakes, however, were common. Pompeii sat in an active seismic zone. A massive earthquake had battered the city in 62 AD, 17 years before the eruption. Temples were destroyed. Houses collapsed. The Forum was shut down for years, but the city bounced back. They rebuilt. They carried on. The tremors rattling the ground in the days leading up to August 24th did not feel any different from the usual quakes. Nobody linked them to Vesuvius. The baker kept the oven burning. It was a routine call. On the morning of August 24th, year 79, he woke up at 3:30. He lit an oil lamp, walked down to the ground floor, fed the fire with dry branches saved from the day before. The donkey that turned the mill was in the stable out back. He led the animal into position, hooked up the harness, set the beast in its circular motion. The top stone began to spin. The familiar sound, stone against stone, filled the room. Grain flowed down from the upper hopper through a hole in the ceiling. It fell between the two stones. It was ground down. The flour poured out the edges and was caught in a ceramic pot. While the mill did its work, the baker mixed the dough. Flour, aqueduct water, salt, natural starter, he mixed it by hand. Kneaded it for 15 minutes. Portioned it out into 14-ounce pieces. Shaped each one into a perfect round. Then he stamped them, a round wooden stamp with 8 radial lines. He pressed it right into the center of each loaf. The mark was branded into the raw dough. By 7 in the morning, the first batch was ready to go in. He opened the hatch, checked the heat. The inside walls were radiating visible waves of heat. He slid the loaves in, organized in neat rows, closed the iron plate, and waited. Vesuvius began to erupt shortly after noon. The baker did not know it. Not yet. He was prepping the final batch of his shift. What comes next is a detail nobody wrote down. The mark the baker pressed into each loaf held a meaning that only makes sense when you understand the commercial system of Pompeii. If you want to keep exploring what was preserved inside these places, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Leave a like if this has already changed the way you see Pompeii. Now let us go back to the bakery. This kind of preservation, human labor frozen in the exact moment, does not happen anywhere else in the ancient world. It is the kind of detail you only find when you step inside the place's history has sealed away. I have put together everything on another giant perfectly preserved, the Titanic, in a complete visual dossier. Construction, engineering, life on board, and the tragedy minute by minute. The link is in the pinned comment of this video. Can you imagine how many places like this are still out there, preserved intact, just waiting for someone to walk in? I have gathered everything on another giant frozen in time, the anatomy of the giant Titanic. A complete visual dossier, construction, life on board, the tragedy minute by minute, all organized into one permanent reference guide. The link is in the pinned comment of this video. Subscribe to the channel to keep exploring what was sealed away. Now let us go back inside the bakery. The baker used the exact same mark on every single loaf. Since he took over the business, he inherited the stamp from his father. His father got it from his grandfather. The mark identified 3 generations of the same family. In Pompeii, where competition between bakeries was cutthroat, the mark was a defense against knockoffs. A customer buying bread from the bakery on the Via dell'Abbondanza expected to see that circular stamp with the 8 lines. If the bread did not have it, it was not from that shop. Fraud was a massive issue. Resellers would buy bread from different bakeries, toss them all in the same basket, and sell them as if they all came from the same oven. The mark stopped that cold. The customer checked. If the stamp did not match, they handed it back. The system worked because the mark was registered, not officially. There was no patent office in Rome But functionally, everyone in Pompeii knew which mark belonged to which bakery. It was public knowledge. The stamp was carved from olive wood, a 5-inch circle, 8 radial lines carved in relief. The baker pressed the stamp into the center of the loaf before sliding it into the oven. The mark sank deep into the raw dough. As it baked, the crust hardened around the stamp, locking it in forever. This technique was not unique to Pompeii. It was standard across the Roman Empire. Bakers' marks have been found in archaeological sites in Gaul, in Hispania, in Britannia, and in Egypt, but none have been preserved with the crystal clarity of the ones in Pompeii, because in Pompeii, time stopped before the bread could be eaten. The choice to keep the oven burning on the morning of August 24th was not reckless. The baker was not ignoring blatant warning signs. The tremors shaking the ground were no different from the quakes Pompeii felt all the time. 17 years earlier, in 62 AD, a massive earthquake had ripped through the city in the middle of the day. Statues toppled, walls cracked, part of the aqueducts caved in, but nobody evacuated. The city recovered. They rebuilt. They moved on. The quake of 62 AD was never tied to Vesuvius. It was just an isolated freak event, one of the many earthquakes that hit the Campania region. The area was seismically active. It always had been. Tremors were just a fact of life. In the days leading up to August 24th, small tremors rumbled. There was no panic, no mass exodus. People went about their routines. They bought bread. They went to the market. They worked. The baker was no different. He had a business to run, customers to feed, a reputation to uphold. Shutting down production just because the ground shook meant losing sales to the guys down the street who kept their ovens hot. So he kept the fire burning. He mixed the dough, shaped the loaves, stamped the mark, slid the batch into the oven. And it was right at that moment, with 81 loaves sitting inside the oven, the heat pushing past 500 degrees Fahrenheit, and that circular mark perfectly branded into every crust. That was when Vesuvius collapsed. The eruption kicked off shortly after midday. Pliny, the younger, nephew of the naturalist who died in the blast, was stationed at Misenum, 18 miles away. He described a pillar of ash punching up from Vesuvius straight into the stratosphere. The column was visible from the entire Bay of Naples. The city of Pompeii sat just 6 miles south of the volcano. The wind was blowing from the northwest. The ash plume was pushed directly over the city. By 1 in the afternoon, the first ash began to fall. Fine, light like gray snow. People stepped out into the streets. They looked up, tried to make sense of what they were seeing. By 2 in the afternoon, pumice stones started raining down. Chunks of light volcanic rock, roughly the size of walnuts. They fell from the sky in a steady barrage, piling up in the streets, on the sidewalks, on the roofs. By 3 in the afternoon, the layer of pumice was 4 inches deep. The sky went pitch black. Visibility dropped to near zero. People started rushing indoors, bolting doors, boarding up windows. The baker was still inside the bakery. The oven was still burning. The 81 loaves were still baking. He did not know that the eruption would not kill with lava, that there would be no time to run, that the structure he thought was safe, brick walls, a tile roof, a stone oven, would not be enough to save him. He had made the exact same call any rational person would make. Keep working, protect the business, wait out the storm. It was an ordinary decision, based on experience, based on the facts he had, based on pure logic. And it is exactly that ordinary nature, the total lack of an obvious mistake, the absence of any reckless gamble, that makes the outcome so haunting. Because what happened next was not born of incompetence. It was not born of ignorance. It was caused by something nobody in Pompeii had the knowledge to see coming. A pyroclastic surge, a force of nature the ancient world did not even have a name for, something that had never been written down in any known text, something completely erased from collective memory, and it was about to slam into the bakery at near 600 degrees Fahrenheit, moving at 60 miles per hour. By 5 in the evening on August 24th, the pumice in the streets of Pompeii was 16 inches deep. The sheer weight started caving in roofs. Wooden-framed houses buckled, tiles slid off, beams snapped. A lot of people tried to make a run for it. They grabbed whatever they could carry, tied pillows over their heads to block the falling rocks. They slogged through the streets, sinking up to their knees in volcanic debris. But the darkness was absolute. The stone rain was relentless. Breathing became a struggle. The air was thick with fine ash that coated the lungs. Many gave up. They turned back inside, sealed their doors and windows, and waited. The baker was among those who stayed put. The bakery had a solid frame, brick walls 2 feet thick, a Roman concrete roof reinforced with heavy timber. There was no reason to think the building would fail. The oven was still blazing hot. The bread was still inside, slowly turning to charcoal as the internal heat spiked because there was no way to vent the air. By 7 in the evening, the eruption shifted into a new, deadly phase. The column of ash towering over Vesuvius, now stretching 18 miles into the sky, began to collapse under its own massive weight. That collapse unleashed something no observer in Pompeii could have ever predicted: an avalanche of superheated gas, ash, and jagged rock tearing down the slopes of the volcano at over 60 miles per hour. A pyroclastic flow. The term would not even be invented until the 20th century, after the eruption of Mount Pelée in Martinique in 1902. But the monster was the exact same: volcanic gas, burning between 600 and 900 degrees Fahrenheit, heavier than air, washing over the landscape like a fluid. The first pyroclastic surge hit Herculaneum, a town just west of Vesuvius, shortly before 8 in the evening. It instantly killed everyone still trapped in the city. The heat was so intense, it vaporized human flesh. The speed was violent enough to shatter stone walls. Pompeii was further away. The hills between Vesuvius and Pompeii deflected the first few surges. The city bought a few extra hours, but at 6:30 in the morning, on August 25th, the 6th pyroclastic surge rolled directly over Pompeii. It flooded the streets, it breached the houses, it filled every single enclosed space. The heat was high enough to kill by thermal shock in less than a second. The people who were still alive, hiding in basements, taking cover behind thick walls, waiting for the nightmare to pass, died before they even knew what hit them. The bakery was struck head-on. The surge blasted through the door, swallowed the mill, rose up into the grain silo, flooded the oven room. The baker was in there. He died instantly. His body was buried in searing hot ash. His flesh vaporized. His bones remained. His final pose locked in place as the ash turned to concrete around him. But the oven, a structure built from fire brick and engineered to take extreme heat, stood its ground. The temperature of the pyroclastic cloud was brutal, but it was not hot enough to melt brick. The shell of the oven survived intact. The iron plate still sealed the opening. The heat inside the oven, already blazing from the roaring fire, skyrocketed as the outside wave of heat washed over it. The 81 loaves trapped inside were subjected to unimaginable temperatures. The water in the dough flashed to steam. The gluten structure completely collapsed. The crust charred solid, but it did not turn to ash, because the heat, while intense, was sealed off just enough to prevent complete oxidation. The bread carbonized. It turned into pure charcoal, but it kept its exact shape. The circular stamp with the 8 radial lines remained perfectly visible, because the mark was branded in before the bake. It was stamped deep into the structure of the crust. And when that crust turned to charcoal, the mark was permanently forged into the carbon. After that 6th surge, Pompeii fell dead silent. There was not a single living soul left in the city. No more sound, no more movement. The ash kept falling for a few more hours. It buried the streets. It blanketed the roofs. It slipped through the cracks. It kept piling up until it formed a solid 20-foot tomb over the entire city. The bakery was completely swallowed. The mill, the oven, the bread, the body of the baker. And then the world forgot. Pompeii vanished from the historical record for the next 1,600 years. Its exact coordinates were lost. The memory of the city faded into dust. All that survived was a vague myth about ancient towns swallowed by a mountain of fire. Meanwhile, 81 loaves of bread sat inside that oven, carbonized, untouched, entombed under 20 feet of hardened ash, just waiting for someone to pry the door open. Nobody could have guessed that door would finally swing open 1,851 years later, and that the bread would still be sitting right there, exactly where the baker left it, with that circular mark perfectly clear on every single crust. The bakery was brought back to the light in 1930. The dig was led by Amedeo Maiuri, the director of excavations at Pompeii from 1924 to 1961. Maiuri was a trained archaeologist. He pioneered systematic digging techniques that saved not just the artifacts, but their exact context. He did not just shovel ash. He logged positions, measured distances, and photographed every single step. When Maiuri's crew hit Region 7, Insula 12, they uncovered a beautifully preserved commercial setup. A stone mill right on the ground floor. They knew what it was instantly, a bakery. But what they found in the back room shattered every expectation. The oven was totally intact. The brickwork had not cracked. The dome had not caved in. The heavy iron plate sealing the hatch was right where it belonged. Maiuri ordered a surgical removal. The plate was pulled back. The opening saw light for the first time in millennia, and inside sat the bread, 81 loaves, lined up in perfect military rows, carbonized, pitch black, hard as solid rock, but holding their original shape flawlessly. The circular mark was glaringly visible on every single one, 8 radial lines shooting out from the center, exactly the way the baker pressed them 1,851 years ago. The crew went dead silent. Finding preserved food in Pompeii was rare. A few charred grains here and there, sure, maybe a broken chunk of crust, but a complete, untouched batch, still sitting in the oven where it was baked, arranged exactly how the baker left it. That had never been seen before. Maiuri took photos, he took measurements, he logged the exact coordinates of every single loaf. Then, he ordered them carefully extracted for preservation in a museum. The bread was shipped off to the National Archaeological Museum of Naples. A few pieces stayed behind in Pompeii, put on display right there at the ruins. All of them placed under strict climate control to stop any further decay. The discovery hit the scientific journals in a technical report in 1932. The paper included the photos, the specs, and a deep dive into the carbonized structure. The verdict was absolute. The bread survived thanks to a freak combination of the oven's blistering heat and the instant airtight seal of the volcanic ash. But there was something far heavier than just the physical preservation that made this find one of a kind. It was the razor-sharp time stamp. Thousands of artifacts have been pulled from the dirt in Pompeii. Wine amphorae, coins, tools, jewelry, furniture, frescoes, mosaics. Every single item was a window into the Roman world. Every piece whispered a secret about how these people lived, but not a single object was anchored to a moment in time as fiercely as the bread in that bakery. A coin could have been minted years before it was dropped. An amphora could have been shaped in a totally different city. A fresco might have been painted decades before the sky fell. But those loaves were slid into that oven on the morning of August 24th, year 79, between 7 and 10 in the morning, and they were scorched into carbon by the pyroclastic surge at 6:30 in the morning on August 25th. That is a window of time measured in hours, not years, not decades. Hours. That brutal precision turned those loaves into something way beyond just an archaeological artifact. They were a ticking stopwatch, cold, hard proof that life in Pompeii kept moving right up to the final breath. It proved they did not run early. It proved there was no real warning, and more than that, it proved the hustle never stopped. The baker was just doing his job. The city was wide awake. Because if that bakery was firing out bread on the morning of August 24th, that meant hungry customers were lining up. The market was open for business. The economic heart of Pompeii was beating strong, just hours before it was ripped out. The circular stamp on the bread hammered that point home. That mark was not there to look pretty. It was pure business, identification, traceability, a shield against fakes. If the baker took the time to stamp the dough, it meant he fully expected to sell it. It meant the economy was grinding gears. It meant everyone believed the world would keep spinning long after that bread came out of the oven. He was wrong, but he had absolutely no way of knowing it. The photographs Mayuri snapped in 1930 reveal details that will stop you in your tracks. The charred crust is smooth, no jagged cracks, no warping. The circular shape holds true. The stamp is loud and clear. Those 8 lines cut through the burnt surface without a flinch. On a few of the loaves, you can even spot the grain of the wooden stamp. Tiny flaws in the circle left by a well-worn tool. On one loaf, there is a tiny smudge right next to the main stamp, most likely a slip of the thumb from the baker when he pressed it down. A raw, human glitch. Proof that this was not some soulless mass production line. It was done by hand, by a man who physically held every single piece of bread. That tiny detail, small, almost invisible, is what makes the discovery feel like a punch to the gut. Because you are no longer just looking at a historical event. You are looking at a human being. A guy who woke up in the dark, mixed his dough, rolled his bread, stamped his mark, and died without a clue that his morning shift would be put behind glass for 2,000 years. The Pompeii loaves are not the only burnt food dug up from the ruins. Grain has been found stashed all over the city. Dried figs, walnuts, olives, all turned to charcoal, all locked in time by that same brutal mix of heat and ash. But the bread stands alone because it is the only food caught right in the middle of being made. The only artifact that was cut down mid-swing. The only piece of history that does not show you the end result, but the exact second the clock stopped. And that right there, the visible interruption, the unfinished shift, the daily grind frozen in amber, that is what elevates these loaves from an artifact to a witness. They don't testify about the disaster. They testify about the silence right before it. When the world was perfectly fine, when nobody had the slightest idea that the end had already begun, and staring at that frozen slice of normal life, more than any terrifying story of the blast, more than any first-hand account from Pliny, that is what makes Pompeii almost too painful to look at. The Pompeii bakery is not the only business caught red-handed by the volcano. Across town, a laundry was dug out with clothes still soaking in the wash vats. In a metal shop, a blacksmith's tools were laying right on the workbench, looking like he just stepped out to grab a bite to eat. In a private home, a dining table was fully set for a meal. Plates, cups, silverware, all lined up perfectly, waiting for a family that never walked back through the door. But those finds are in the areas we have actually dug up. 2 out of every 3 buildings in Pompeii are still buried under 20 feet of rock-hard ash. They have not seen the sun since the year 79. They are sitting down there in the dark, looking exactly the way they did in the last microsecond before the surge hit. Nobody knows what ghosts are waiting inside those walls. How many more bakeries have fires still set in the hearth? How many more workshops were cut down in the middle of a job? How many places were running at full speed when time simply ran out? And nobody knows how long they will stay buried, because digging is just controlled destruction. The second you expose ancient walls to modern air, the clock starts ticking again, and they begin to rot. So every choice to dig is a choice to speed up the end. But there is somewhere else, not Pompeii. Another site swallowed by the exact same mountain, a place where the preservation went even deeper, where the ground didn't just swallow objects, but kept complete records of an interrupted world that have never fully seen the light of day. And that place remains almost entirely untouched, right up to this very second. The deepest secret the volcano kept safe was not the eruption itself. It was the ordinary. Pompeii was wiped off the map in a single day. But what makes Pompeii stand alone is not how it died. It is what survived from the last second it lived. The routine, the grind, life moving forward, totally blind to the fact that it was about to be turned off forever. Those 81 loaves of bread sitting in the oven are the physical proof of that blindness. They are not a monument to a massive tragedy. They are a monument to a regular Tuesday, a standard choice, an everyday job. The baker woke up, lit the fire, mixed the dough, shaped the loaves, pressed the stamp, shoved the batch inside, and waited. Just like he did every single day, just like he had done 1,000 times before, and exactly how he planned to do it 1,000 times again. He had no idea this was the last batch, that the stamp he pressed into the dough would outlast empires, that the boring, repetitive work he did every morning would be frozen in time and dissected by scientists 2 millennia later. And it is exactly that total innocence, that complete blackout of what was looming over his head, that makes the bread so unsettling to stare at. Because they do not prove that epic disasters happen. They prove something far more terrifying. They prove that your life can be running flawlessly. Every choice you make can be smart, every safety net can be in place, and against all odds, in a matter of hours, the board can be wiped clean without a shred of warning. The bread sat in that oven for 1,851 years. The circular stamp never faded. The brick walls never crumbled. And when they finally cracked the door open in 1930, everything was sitting right where the baker left it. It looked like he just ran out to grab more firewood, like he was going to walk back through the door any second, like time itself had forgotten to move. But time did move, and the baker never came back, and the bread just sat there, waiting for nobody, witnessing nothing, preserved by a random twist of fate in a room that was never meant to survive past the afternoon bake. That is the real truth Pompeii leaves us with. It is not a lesson about volcanoes. It is not a history lesson about Romans. It is a lesson about time, about how ordinary life can just snap in half without a warning bell, about how your life's work can be left hanging in the middle of a sentence, about how your final moment on Earth will probably look exactly like every other moment until suddenly it doesn't. The bakery in Pompeii is still open for tourists. The bread sits behind glass in museums. The high-resolution photos of the circular stamp are floating around the internet. Anyone can look at it. Anyone can study it. Anyone can step up to the glass and look right at a job somebody left unfinished 2,000 years ago. But absolutely nobody can answer the question. Those loaves have been silently screaming since the day they were pulled from the dirt. The question that isn't etched into any stone, that nobody ever asked out loud, but that echoes in every single line, carved into that blackened crust. If the baker of Pompeii had known that was his last batch, would he have done anything different? Would he have pressed the stamp with a little more pride? Would he have lined the loaves up a little straighter? Would he have dropped his tools and run for the hills? Or would he have done the exact same thing? Because there was absolutely no hard evidence telling him to run. Because the earthquakes were just part of the background noise? Because life had to go on? Because the job had to get done? We will never get an answer. Because that man died, having no idea the clock had run out. Having no idea that leaving the oven on was the final choice he would ever make. Having no idea that his blue-collar morning shift would be immortalized as something extraordinary. And maybe that is it. Maybe that total inability to know which moment is going to be your last is what makes the bread of Pompeii so devastating to look at. Because they do not show you a mistake. They show you a man doing everything right. They show life working perfectly, the job getting done, smart choices being made. and they show you that, in the end, none of it was enough. The circular stamp with the 8 radial lines is still there, 2,000 years later, clearer than the names of emperors, stronger than the marble statues in the square, outliving every single monument built to stand the test of time, not because it was designed to last forever, but because it was made in the exact fraction of a second when time stood still. And as long as Pompeii stays buried, with 2/3 of the city still suffocating under the ash, completely unexplored, totally locked down since the year 79, there are going to be more bakeries down there in the dark, more workshops with tools left on the bench, more absolute proof of normal life frozen solid, just waiting for someone to pry the door open and see what gets left behind when nobody ever gets the chance to come back.